The door was not fully closed. 3 inches of space existed between the heavy wooden frame and its latch, and through that gap, on the morning of her own wedding, Ilara Voss heard Alpha King Zarin Blackwood say her name, in a voice that held not a single thread of warmth. Her feet stopped moving on their own. She had been walking down the south corridor of the Northern Court Palace with 45 minutes remaining before her ceremony, and the sound of her own name, spoken like a term in a contract, stopped her as completely as a wall. She had been managing her nerves the way she always managed them, with slow, deliberate breathing, with the discipline of thinking forward rather than sideways, with the practiced composure of a woman who had learned over 32 years that feelings were real, but they did not have to run the show. Her wedding gown was on, ivory silk with gold threading at the cuffs and hem, made by a seamstress in the court who had been given precise instructions and had followed them to the letter. Zarin had spent more than an hour building a crown braid in her silver blonde hair and pressing small white blooms into the plaits at intervals, until the whole arrangement looked as though it had grown there naturally, something ancient and unhurried, which was exactly the effect Zarin had intended, and exactly the quality she brought to everything she touched. The bouquet in Ilara's hands was white roses. She had not chosen them herself. Mrs. Alden, the ceremony coordinator, had presented her with a selection 3 days prior, and Ilara had approved this one because it seemed appropriate, and she had not had strong feelings about flowers. The roses were cool-stemmed and tight-budded, not yet open. She had thought earlier that morning, when Zarin first placed them in her hands, that they looked like things still making up their mind. That observation seemed more relevant now than it had then. Ilara Voss is a sensible choice, Zarin said. His voice moved clean and unhurried through the palace stone, finding its way through that 3-inch gap with perfect clarity. He did not raise it. He had never, in all the time she had observed him, needed to. The acoustic quality of his authority meant the room arranged itself around what he was saying, rather than the other way around. Her bloodline is adequate, her conduct is well documented, and unlikely to produce complications. Her father's agreement resolves the Eastern Alliance without any additional terms or negotiation required on our side. That is exactly what this marriage is, Harrow. A well-structured arrangement. A sound one. Nothing beyond that. I need you to hold that understanding clearly, so we do not have confusion later. Elder Harrow's voice came back through the gap, dry, practiced, the voice of a man who had spent 4 decades in the service of the Northern Crown, learning when to speak, and precisely how. Of course, my lord. And do you believe the young lady shares that clarity of understanding? She is a practical woman, Zarin said. The phrase was not unkind. That was almost the worst part of it. The complete absence of unkindness from a sentence that landed like a verdict. I met her on 2 occasions, and both times she conducted herself without sentiment or confusion. She will understand what she is entering, and I intend to treat her with the appropriate respect and conduct that her position requires, within those terms. A pause. The kind that says a thought has concluded. This is not a complicated situation. No, Harrow agreed. Then, after a pause that was itself a kind of art, calibrated, specific, the pause of a man who had chosen exactly when to ask the question he was about to ask. And Lyra? The silence that followed that name was not long. 3 seconds, perhaps 4, but it had a quality that distinguished it from the silences surrounding it, the way a particular note distinguishes itself from the ones before and after. It was the silence of a man who has been asked about the one real thing in a room full of managed things, and it told Ilara, standing in the corridor with her bouquet and her composed expression, and the remains of 2 years of careful hope, everything she needed to know about the architecture of what she had just married herself to. When Zarin spoke again, his voice had changed, not dramatically, not in any way that a stranger would have detected, but she had spent the morning learning to read him, and she heard it, a tightening at the edges, the effort of control that had not been required in the rest of the conversation. Do not bring that name into this conversation, he said. What I carry personally is mine, and it belongs in a separate category. What I do for the crown is another category entirely. Those distinctions exist for a reason, and I need you to respect them. A beat. This is not the moment for that discussion. Understood, Harrow said, quiet and without argument. Ilara turned away from the door. She moved carefully. She understood, in the particular clarity that comes from receiving something unexpected, that the sound she made in this corridor right now had meaning, and she made as little of it as possible. 1 step, then another, Then she was moving away from the door, and the corridor was carrying her forward, and her face was doing the thing she had learned to do many years ago, when she needed the outside of herself to function, while the inside processed something difficult, smooth, composed, giving nothing away. The bouquet was still in her hands, the roses were still cool. She held them against her chest and walked. She had known this was a political arrangement. That was not the injury. She was not a woman who had walked into this morning pretending otherwise. When her father, Owen Voss, had come to her, 2 years ago at their family estate, a late evening in the garden, the light going soft and golden, her book open on her lap, and his face carrying that expression she knew well, the one he wore when he had made a decision and was not certain of her response. She had understood the shape of what he was telling her before he had finished his second sentence. An arrangement with the Northern Crown, her hand in exchange for a border alliance that would protect thousands of people who depended on the Voss family's position. A marriage to a king she had never met. She had asked her 2 questions. First, had Zarin Blackwood agreed to this willingly, or had he been pressured into it? Her father had said yes, though not immediately, which had told her something. Second, what would happen to the border families, to their own people, to the alliance they had spent 4 years cultivating, if she declined? Her father had been honest about that too, which was one of the things she most valued about him. His honesty even when it cost him something. The consequences would be severe, not catastrophic, but severe and lasting. She had made her decision. She had decided to go forward, and to go forward fully, not passively, not in resignation or defeat. She had made an active, considered choice. The choice of a woman who understood that her circumstances were not always within her control, but her response to them was, and who had decided to bring every real thing she had into this marriage, rather than showing up as a diminished version of herself. She had spent the 2 years in between preparing, with the same rigor she brought to everything important. She had studied the Northern Court's history and customs and governance and political structure. She had thought carefully and honestly about what a genuine partnership could be built from, even between 2 people who had not chosen each other freely. She had decided that patience and genuine presence, and the willingness to keep seeing someone clearly over time, were enough of a foundation to grow something real on, if both people were willing to build. She had believed it was possible. She had believed it was possible when she packed her things and said goodbye to the family estate. She had believed it on the journey north, watching the landscape change from the rolling hills she knew to the stone and sharp sky of the northern territories. She had believed it when she arrived and walked into a palace that was larger and colder than anything she had ever inhabited. And she had believed it through the 2 formal dinners and the photograph sessions and the briefings with Mrs. Alden and the ceremony rehearsal and the sleepless first night in a room that didn't yet know her. She had carried that belief into this morning as carefully as the bouquet, and the man in that room had just told his most trusted advisor that she was a political variable. Resolved. The word itself, resolved, was the one that sat inside her chest and pressed. She reached the junction, where the south corridor met the east passage, and there was a window there that looked down over the inner courtyard 2 stories below, and she stopped. The courtyard was busy with the quiet efficiency of a place that had been preparing for a large event for several days, and was now in the final hours of that preparation. Servants moved across the stone paths with purpose, carrying things, flower arrangements and silver serving pieces and covered trays, moving from the kitchen wing to the reception hall in steady, practiced lines. 2 guards stood at the far arch with the absolute stillness of people who had trained themselves to treat standing still as its own form of competence. The sky above the courtyard was pale and clear, and entirely indifferent to what was happening to Alara in the corridor above it, which she found oddly steady rather than bleak. The sky did not require anything of her. That was something. She breathed. She breathed slowly and deliberately, and she let what was happening move through her at its own speed, rather than trying to rush it out or bury it before it had finished making itself known. The hope she had brought into this morning was not a fantasy. She had not invented a man who did not exist and then loved the invention. She had made a considered decision to believe in a possibility, and that possibility had now been clearly ruled out by the man himself, in his own words, spoken to someone he trusted more than he would ever trust her. She let herself feel how much that hurt. She let it sit exactly where it was, without minimizing it, or covering it over with practicality, before it had finished. It was a grief, not the sharp kind, not the kind that blindsides you when you had no reason to expect it, the settling kind, the kind that comes from losing something you had been holding carefully without being entirely certain it was real. She heard Saren step up quietly beside her. The handmaid had been trailing at her customary half-step distance throughout the morning, and had not spoken since they left the dressing room, and was not speaking now. She simply stood. This was one of the deepest things Alara valued about Saren, who had been with her since the age of 14. The woman understood, with a rarity that Alara had never taken for granted, when presence was more useful than language. After a moment, Saren said, very quietly, "Did you hear something you weren't meant to?" "I need a moment," Alara said. "You have approximately 3 minutes before Mrs. Alden appears at the end of this corridor, and begins communicating emergency with her posture," Saren said. The corner of Alara's mouth moved almost imperceptibly. 3 minutes is enough. She used every one of them. She stood at the window and breathed, and watched the courtyard below, and let the thing she was feeling move through her at its own pace. When it was done, not resolved, not healed, but finished, the way a wave is finished when it has reached its full height and begun to pull back, she turned. "All right," she said. Her voice was level. Her chin was at its natural angle. Her grip on the roses had relaxed back to the correct pressure. Saren looked at her with an expression that was several things at once, and quietly held all of them, and said nothing. She moved back to her position a half-step behind. The antechamber was through the carved double doors at the end of the south passage. It had been dressed in the combined colors of both families, deep blue and black woven on the banners hanging from the ceiling, candles burning on every available surface, the smell of warm wax and ceremony filling the room with something that should have felt welcoming, and almost did. Owen Voss was standing at the window when Alara pushed through the doors, and he turned at the sound, and his face went through exactly the sequence she had been expecting and loving her whole life. Still, then soft, then a smile that began somewhere deeper than his face, and worked its way outward slowly, like light filling a room. He crossed to her, and took both her hands. His were warm, and his grip was steady, and she focused on that, the warmth, the steadiness, and held it. He was 61 years old this winter, her father, silver-haired and carefully postured, with the particular quality of a man who had spent decades carrying invisible weight, and had gotten very good at not showing the effort of it. He was wearing his best coat, the dark one he saved for things that mattered, and his father's silver cufflinks, and he had clearly been crying at some point in the past hour, though he was not crying now, and would not have admitted it if asked. He looked at his daughter in her wedding gown, and he looked like a man who had put down something very heavy. "You look exactly like her," he said. His voice did what it always did when he spoke of Alara's mother. It caught, just slightly, on the memory of her. On the morning of our wedding, she stood in the doorway, in a gown the color of cream, and I forgot every word I had planned to say. He looked at Alara for a long moment, his eyes moving across her face with the particular careful attention of a parent who has spent decades learning to read their child and trusts what they see. "How are you, truly?" She looked at his face. She thought about the gap in the door, and the words through it, and the specific silence after a name. She thought about what it would do to him if she described what she had heard, the look that would come into his eyes, the particular guilt of a father who has given his daughter to something that turned out to have less in it than he believed. She thought about the 4 years he had spent building this alliance. She thought about how proud he looked this morning. She did not tell him. "I am ready," she said. It was the most honest version of what was true. She was not at peace. She did not have the distance or the time for peace yet. But she was ready in the real sense, clear-eyed, standing upright, all of herself present and accounted for, prepared to do what she had agreed to do with full knowledge of what it was. Ready was sometimes the bravest thing available, and she had decided it was enough. Owen searched her face for a moment, with the penetrating attention of a man who knew her, and something moved in his expression. A father's awareness of a daughter's unspoken thing, the particular discomfort of sensing something you cannot name, and cannot ask about without seeming to doubt. But then the formal bell rang once from inside the great hall, deep and resonant, and the moment passed. He offered her his arm. She took it. The great hall doors opened before them with the practiced smoothness of mechanisms built for exactly this moment, and the music swelled outward into the antechamber, formal strings building toward something stately and large, and the light from the chandeliers above the hall caught in the gold threading of Ilara's gown and sent it back across the room in ripples, and she stepped forward. There were hundreds of people. She had known there would be, had been told the number multiple times, had even reviewed the seating chart as part of her preparation. But knowing a number and stepping into the physical reality of it were different things, and the physical reality was this: hundreds of faces turning toward her simultaneously, hundreds of people rising to their feet in a long wave of motion along both sides of the aisle, the combined attention of all of them pressing forward like weather. She moved between them, measured steps, her spine holding its angle, her bouquet at the correct position, her expression arranged in the way she had practiced for this moment. Not cold, not brittle, not stiff or hollow or performatively serene, but contained, present, here in the full sense of the word. The aisle was long and lined with white flowers. The roses in her hands were cool. At the far end, at the altar dressed in the deep silver and blue of the Blackwood house, Zarin stood with his hands correctly clasped and watched her approach. He did not step forward. He did not lean to see her better. He did not alter his expression. He simply waited, with the absolute composure of a man for whom the world arranges itself, and who has learned to receive that arrangement as his natural condition. He watched her walk toward him with the precise, focused attention of a man watching something moving correctly into position, and when she was close enough to see the quality of his eyes, dark, still, revealing nothing, she held his gaze and kept walking. She reached the altar. Her father placed her hand in Zarin's. Zarin received it with careful precision, and his fingers were cool and dry, and his eyes met hers for a moment that was brief and searching, and then professionally neutral again. Ilara looked back at him and thought, I know exactly what this is now. And I am still here, standing, not because I have been led here blind, because I am choosing, with full knowledge, to begin. The officiant raised his voice. The ceremony began. Elder Greaves had officiated weddings in the Northern Court for more than 30 years, and his voice showed it. It was the voice of a man who had learned over decades how to carry the weight of an occasion without being crushed by it or inflated by it. Steady and deep and unhurried, each word placed with the particular care of someone who understood that some words, once said in front of witnesses, could not be unsaid, and that this mattered. He spoke first of the court's tradition. He spoke of the long history of bonded unions in the Northern Territories, going back further than most of the families assembled could trace their own bloodlines, to the time when the laws governing such unions were made not by courts and councils, but by something older and less debatable. He spoke of responsibility, of the thing two people take on when they agree to build a life together, not just for themselves, but for the communities that depend on what they become. Ilara listened. She listened the way she listened to everything important, completely, without the surface of her mind wandering to other considerations. The hall was warm from the candles and the gathered bodies of several hundred people, and the warmth pressed against her pleasantly after the cold of the morning corridors. Around her, the assembled guests were entirely still, holding the particular stillness of a crowd that has decided to witness something, and is taking that decision seriously. The weight of their attention was real. She could feel it on her skin, against her shoulders, as a gentle and constant pressure that gave the moment a gravity it would not have had in an empty room. At her side, Zarin stood without moving. He gave Greaves his full attention, the same quality of focused, precise attention he gave to everything that required it. She watched his profile in the candlelight, and she thought about what she had heard in the corridor. She thought about the effort it had cost him to say nothing when Harrow spoke that name. She thought about the real person she believed existed somewhere inside the composed exterior. She still believed it. That was the truth of it. She had not stopped believing it simply because the morning had been painful. And she thought about the difference between a real person existing somewhere and that person being available to her. Greaves turned to Zarin for the vows. Zarin spoke them clearly. He gave each word its proper weight, and his voice was even throughout, and he did not stumble, or hesitate, or add anything that was not written into the traditional form. He said commitment, and respect, and protection, and fidelity, with the same quality of thorough attention he brought to everything, and the words were good words. Ilara had always thought the traditional northern vows were good ones, built over generations to contain real meaning. and hearing them in Zaren's voice was like watching an excellent craftsman work with materials they respect but do not love. Then Greaves turned to her. She had not written anything down. She had memorized the vows and reviewed them enough times that they were available to her the way her own name was, simply and completely, without effort. She looked at Zaren and she said them. And here was what she discovered, saying the words, they were still true. Every one of them. Not in the romantic sense she might once have imagined, standing in a garden 2 years ago thinking about what a real marriage might feel like, but in the grounded, eyes-open sense she had arrived at through everything the morning had brought her. She meant to respect him. She did respect him, as a leader, as a man who operated with seriousness and precision, as someone whose faults were not the faults of cruelty but of construction. She meant the commitment she was making. She was not performing at the altar. She was saying true things in a complicated context, and she was old enough and honest enough to know that was how most real things were said. She finished. Her voice had been level throughout. Greaves produced the rings, 2 bands of dark metal and pale gold, worked with a design that wove the Blackwood and Voss patterns together. Zaren took her ring and placed it on her finger with care, and she felt its weight settle, cool and clean and precise. Then she took his and placed it on his hand, and as she did, his eyes moved to her face for just a moment, and she met them, and held them, and did not drop her gaze or soften it. He held that look 2 seconds longer than the ceremony required. She thought about that. She filed it away with everything else. By the bond declared before this court, and these witnesses, Greaves said, and his voice lifted with the formal weight of a conclusion, built for exactly this line. You are united as one. The hall released its held breath all at once, and the applause rose around them, full, warm, genuine. People had come from great distances, and they were glad to have come. Elara heard her father's specific rhythm somewhere in the middle of the sound, and closed her eyes for just a moment, just long enough to let that reach her, and then opened them again, and turned to face the room. They processed through the inner courtyard in the bright afternoon, the full light of midday on the pale stone, the elaborate arrangement of white flowers along every path and railing, the way the sky had deepened to the rich, specific blue that only exists in the middle of a clear day, and nowhere else. It was beautiful. Elara had grown up in a family estate of quiet, careful beauty, but this was something else. A beauty constructed at scale, by people with the resources to do exactly what they intended, and they had intended this. She moved through it with Zaren at her side. He was courteous and exactly correct at every moment, her name spoken properly, his hand at her back when the movement required it, his attention given to the appropriate person at the appropriate moment. He made no error. He caused no awkwardness. He was, by every external measurement, a model of how a king conducted himself at his own wedding reception. He did not speak to her directly, not once during the entire procession, not a comment on the day, not a question about how she was holding up, not even a neutral exchange about the weather or the setting. The space between them was occupied entirely by other people and by Zaren's correct management of those people, and she noticed this the way you notice an absence, not by looking for it, but by feeling the air where something was supposed to be. Lady Cora pulled her aside briefly near the south garden door, a compact woman in her late 60s, with the upright posture and the direct gaze of someone who had long ago stopped troubling herself with social performance. She looked at Elara with the sharp, affectionate scrutiny of a woman who had known her as a child, and was now looking at what had come of that child. You moved beautifully down that aisle, she said, like someone who knows exactly who she is. Getting there, Elara said. Lady Cora smiled with real warmth. Your mother said the same thing on her wedding morning. She said she was getting there. A pause. She arrived. It took a while, but she arrived. Elara held her gaze. How long? Long enough that she stopped counting, Lady Cora said, and that was when she knew she had made it. She squeezed Elara's arm once, firmly, and moved on. The photographs were taken. The formal presentations were made. The afternoon light went gold and long, and the evening smell of the palace kitchens, something rich and warm, a meal being prepared with both skill and care, reached them through the corridors as the wedding party moved inside. The banquet hall had been transformed during the ceremony, layered now with candlelight and the full setting of a royal reception, the tables dressed with crystal and silver and the Blackwood house colors in the linens, the musicians already playing something light and graceful from their position at the far end of the room. Ilara was seated at the head table beside Zarin. She settled into her chair and looked out over the assembled room. Hundreds of people finding their places, the low music of conversation layering over the formal music, the particular alive warmth of a large celebration in motion. She took it in and let it be what it was. Not what she had hoped the evening would be, what it actually was. The dinner course came. Conversations moved across the tables. The wine was excellent. She spoke with the people nearest her on both sides, with the genuine attentiveness she always brought to individual conversations. And these were not performances. She had always been genuinely interested in people, in what they thought, and what they were working on, and what they had seen. And tonight, this quality was her most useful tool, because it kept her inside the present moment, rather than inside the complicated interior weather of everything she was carrying. Zarin sat at her side. He was correct and unfailing. He said her name at exactly the right moments. He occupied his role with the total competence that was simply who he was. He did not ask her what she thought of the wine. He did not comment on the musicians, who were very good. He did not turn to her between courses and say anything at all. She counted. She was not surprised by what she found. Then the dinner course was cleared, and the space of perhaps 10 minutes opened, in which Ilara sat and breathed, and let the evening settle around her, and she was just beginning to find a rhythm in the stillness of those minutes, when the great hall doors opened. Not quietly, not with the apologetic restraint of a late arrival. They opened fully, the way doors are opened by someone who has decided the doors are there to be opened, and the room felt it before most people saw it. A shift in the air, a quality of alertness moving through the assembled guests like a current. Through the doors walked a man she did not know. Tall, broad-shouldered, dark-haired. He moved through the entrance the way a river moves through a narrow channel, not forcing itself, but simply moving in the direction that was available, as though the space had been shaped for exactly this passage. He wore no crown and carried no formal insignia, and he was dressed in traveling clothes of dark, practical quality. And none of that mattered, because the quality of his presence as he came through those doors and stood inside the room was impossible to misread. This was a man who was accustomed to the weight of authority, and had been for long enough that the weight had become invisible to him, which was the most definitive kind. The room thinned. The conversations fell away in a wave that moved inward from the doors, first the tables nearest the entrance, then the ones behind them, then the room entire, and in that quiet, she heard Lord Wren speak a name to the man beside him, not loudly, but in a room that had gone still, clearly enough. Caspian Devereux, king of the Eastern realm. His eyes moved across the room in a swift, deliberate survey, mapping it rather than admiring it, and then they found Ilara, and stopped. He looked at her across the full length of the banquet hall, as though there was no one else in the room, and he had not expected to need to look for very long. Not aggressively, not with the pointed directness of a man trying to make a statement. With something that was harder to name, certain and focused and entirely undisguised, the look of a man who has come to confirm something, and is in the process of confirming it. Ilara held his gaze. She did not look away. Something moved through her when their eyes met. Not recognition. She had never seen this man before in her life. Something that had the quality of recognition. Something that arrived in the center of her chest and sat there, warm and precise, like a hand pressed deliberately against the inside of her sternum. Beside her, Zarin had risen slowly from his chair. The two kings looked at each other across the room. And then Caspian began to walk. Zarin moved from behind the head table, with the measured pace of a man who had decided what his conduct looked like in this situation, and was choosing it actively, step by step, because the situation required active choice rather than instinct. His hands were at his sides. His expression was controlled in the specific way it became controlled when something required management he had not anticipated. Not the easy composure of a man at rest, but the held composure of a man exerting effort and doing it well. Two of his guards had shifted position without being visibly signaled. They were 3 steps closer to their king than they had been a moment ago, and their posture had changed by a fraction. Ilara noted all of this the way she noted everything, cleanly, precisely, filing it in the part of her mind that was always quietly compiling information about the rooms she moved through. Caspian was walking in no hurry. He moved with the even, self-contained pace of a man who had made his decision before he crossed the threshold, and no longer needed to rush any part of what happened next. He had looked away from Alara once Zarin rose, not because he had to, but with the quality of a man who understood when to redirect his attention. He was looking at Zarin now, and the look between them as the distance closed was the compressed, specific quality of two forces that had been aware of each other from a distance for some time, and were now occupying the same room for the first time. They stopped perhaps 12 feet apart. "Devereaux," Zarin said. His voice was precise and neutral in a way that required effort. The specific neutrality of a very powerful man choosing not to show his full hand, because showing it would make the situation harder to manage. "This gathering was not one I extended an invitation to you for." Caspian stopped. He was close enough now that Alara could see him properly. The strong, unhurried line of his jaw, the directness of his eyes, which were a dark gray-green that caught the candlelight at the angle of this room in a specific way. He was perhaps 35, possibly slightly older. He had a face that had been through something real, and had not been diminished by it, which was a particular kind of face that Alara had always found herself trusting. "No," Caspian said. "You didn't invite me." He said it without apology and without deflection, simply acknowledging a fact that was true and did not require embellishment. Then, holding Zarin's gaze with a steadiness that was not aggressive but was entirely solid, "I understood that before I came." Zarin's expression tightened by one precise degree. "Then you understand that your presence constitutes an intrusion into a private." "I understood the risk before I came," Caspian said, "and I made the decision to accept it." He said it without volume and without heat, the voice of a man who has thought about something thoroughly and arrived at a position he intends to hold. "I am not here as an adversary. I am not here to cause disruption or to make a political statement. I am here because there is something in this room that required me to be here, and I am the kind of man who deals with what is in front of him directly, rather than managing it from a comfortable distance." A pause, brief and clean. "I have found that approach to serve better in the long run." The hall was almost entirely silent. Even the musicians had finished their piece and not begun another. "You will not make a scene at my wife's reception," Zarin said. The word wife was weighted with deliberate precision. A marked territory. Something moved across Caspian's face at that word. A tightening, very brief, that vanished before it could become a feature of his expression. But it happened. And Alara, who had been watching him with the same complete attention she had been giving everything since the morning, caught it and noted it. "I have no interest in scenes," Caspian said. "I have interest in a formal introduction, if that is something you are willing to provide." His eyes moved to Alara again, directly, without apology or performance. Nothing more than that, at this moment. A silence, long enough to mean something, though not so long that the room lost its breath. Then Zarin turned to the table. "My wife," he said. "Alara." Caspian closed the remaining distance to the head table and stood before her. Up close, she could see things that distance had not permitted. The lines at the corners of his eyes that came from weather or thought or years of both. The quality of steadiness in him at close range that was not the stillness of a man suppressing something, but the stillness of a man who was genuinely at rest with where he was standing. He inclined his head toward her in a formal bow, short and honest, the kind that comes from actual regard rather than choreographed court performance. "Queen Alara," he said, "I am Caspian Devereaux. I apologize for the timing of my arrival today. That apology is genuine." He held her gaze, and she felt that she was being seen. Not assessed, not evaluated, but seen, in the particular way of someone who is paying real attention, rather than the appearance of attention. "If I had known with more certainty when today was, I would have found a way to arrive sooner. As it happened, I learned this morning." "Then you would have come regardless of the date," she said. A beat. "Yes," he said. The word was simple and complete, and took up exactly the space it required. It landed in the quiet of the hall. Beside her, she felt Zarin go very still in a new way. Alara held Caspian's gaze for 2 full seconds. Then she looked away. Not in retreat, not in fear, but in the way you look away from a light, when you need a moment to let your eyes adjust to what they have seen. She picked up her wineglass, set it down without drinking from it, breathed. Around them, the room had begun to remember how to function. A conversation started near the back. The musicians, reading the moment, with the instinct of people who had spent their careers understanding rooms, began something quiet and neutral. The guests, with the collective social intelligence of people who had attended many formal events and understood the etiquette of pretending not to have witnessed something significant while fully witnessing it, resumed the activity of attending a reception. But the room was different now, the temperature of it. Something had come through those doors with Caspian Devereaux that was still present in the air, settled and permanent, and Alara understood, looking at the wine in her glass and listening to the music resume, that the evening had shifted into something she had not planned for, and could not manage her way out of. She was not certain she wanted to. The dancing began after the dinner service was cleared. It was a formal tradition of the Northern Court. The wedding couple opened the floor, and then the guests were invited to follow, and the evening moved from the structured formality of the table to the slightly warmer register of music and movement. Mrs. Alden had briefed Alara on this in detail, as she had briefed her on every element of the day's schedule. The wedding couple's opening dance was timed to approximately 3 minutes. Alara and Zarin had practiced it 2 days prior under Mrs. Alden's focused direction, running through the steps until they could perform them without visible effort. The practice had served its purpose. The opening dance was exactly what it had been rehearsed to be: correct, graceful, performed with the precision that rehearsal produces. Zarin led with complete confidence. His hand at her back was in the correct position. His timing did not waver. They moved through the steps without error or hesitation, and the guests watched with warm approval and genuine pleasure. Because the dance was genuinely beautiful, even if it was the beauty of 2 competent people executing a choreographed thing. 2 minutes and 40 seconds. She had counted. When it ended and Zarin withdrew toward his advisors, the gravitational center to which he always returned when not required to be elsewhere, and the other guests moved onto the floor, Alara positioned herself near the tall south-facing windows where the candlelight was slightly less dense and the air marginally cooler, and she spoke with the people who came to her, and she was genuinely present with each of them, because being genuinely present with people was something she had always been able to do, regardless of her own circumstances, and tonight, it was the most useful thing she had. She had been standing there perhaps 20 minutes, in a conversation with an elderly lord, whose name she had been given, and temporarily misplaced, and a woman from the Southern Territories, who had known Alara's mother, and wanted her to know it, when she became aware, with the specific peripheral awareness of a person who has been paying close attention to a room all evening, that someone was moving toward her left side. She did not need to turn. She turned anyway. Caspian was standing at a careful distance, close enough to be addressing her specifically, far enough to be entirely appropriate, and she understood that the distance was chosen rather than incidental, that he had thought about exactly where to stand, and had stood there with intention. He looked at her with the same directness he had brought to every moment since he walked through the hall doors. "I am aware," he said, "that asking you to dance tonight requires your agreement first, and a significant amount of confidence in my own timing second. I have the confidence. I am asking for the agreement." "Both things are accurate," she said. "I know." He held her gaze steadily and without urgency. "Will you?" She considered him. She considered what it meant to say yes, what it would look like, what would be read into it, who was watching. She considered Zarin's position in the room, which she was aware of without actively locating it. She considered the ring on her finger, and the ceremony that had ended 4 hours ago. She considered all of these things. She also considered the warmth that had been sitting in the center of her chest since he walked through the hall doors, the steady, specific warmth that had not dimmed or shifted or required attention to maintain, simply present, the way something real is present. "Yes," she said. They moved to the center of the floor. He placed his hand at her back with the formal positioning of the dance, correct and unhurried, and she put her hand in his. The moment their palms met, both of them went entirely still. It was not a gradual thing. It was not something that built from a smaller thing into a larger one. It was immediate and complete. A warmth that moved up her arm and spread across her chest, and settled in the center of her like a struck bell, still resonating, present in her hands and her throat, and the space behind her sternum where her ribs came together. She heard herself draw a small, sharp, involuntary breath, and she had no control over it. Caspian had not taken a single dance step. He was completely still. The music continued around them. Other couples moved in their slow circles. And at the center of the floor, the two of them stood without moving, held by something that was warm and real, and unlike anything Alara had felt in 32 years of living. She looked at his face. His eyes were different. Not his expression. That was still composed, still controlled. The face of a man who was capable of maintaining his exterior, regardless of his interior. But something behind the eyes had shifted, a quality of aliveness that had not been visible before, or that had been visible but was now unmistakable. The look of a room whose light has been turned on. "What is that?" she said. Her voice was steadier than it should have been. "You know what it is," he said, quietly, carefully. "Tell me," she said. "Tell me in words." He looked at her for a long moment. Around them, the floor adjusted its movement to accommodate the stillness at its center, couples flowing around them the way water flows around a stone, and she was aware of this without attending to it. "A mate bond," he said. He placed the words with the weight they deserved, not dramatically, but honestly. "It is real, Alara. It has existed between us before this room, and before this day, before we had ever occupied the same space. We simply had not been within proximity for it to become visible." He held her gaze without flinching. "I am not telling you this to change what today is, or to complicate your situation beyond what it already is. I am telling you because you deserve to know what just happened, and I am not willing to be the person who possesses that truth and withholds it from you." She absorbed this. She let it move through her and find its level. "You came here for this," she said. "I came because I learned this morning, from a source I trust completely, that you existed, and that this bond was real between us, and that if I did not come today, if I let today pass, I would spend the rest of my life knowing exactly what I had allowed to happen." He said it without performance. Simply, the way you say something that is true, and has cost you something to determine, and that you have decided to say regardless. "I am not proud of the timing. I have thought about that every hour since I started writing. There is no version of this that is clean or convenient, or without consequence. I know that. And you came anyway," she said. "And I came anyway," he said. "Yes." She stood on the dance floor with the music moving around them, and the warmth still sitting in the center of her chest, like something that had found where it lived, and did not intend to leave. And she looked at Caspian Devereux, and she thought about everything the day had brought her. The gap in the door, the cold vows, the ring settling on her finger with a weight that had nothing warm inside it. And now this man, this warmth. She became aware of Zarin across the room. She did not need to search for him. She simply felt the specific quality of his attention before she found him with her eyes. He was standing at the edge of the floor, away from his advisors, and he was looking at her. Not at Caspian, at her. And his expression was not composed. Not fully. Something was moving behind it that she had not seen there in any of their interactions before this moment. Something that had the quality of a thing that has been undisturbed for a very long time, being disturbed by something it did not expect. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked away. The music ended. She released Caspian's hand and stepped back. The warmth in her chest did not leave. It simply went quieter. The way a struck bell goes quieter as time passes, but does not stop resonating. "Thank you for telling me the truth," she said. "Thank you for receiving it," he said. She turned and walked back toward the edge of the room, and she knew, as she walked, that the evening had just divided itself into a before and an after, and that everything that came next was the after, and that the after was going to require everything she had. She found, to her own surprise, that she was not afraid of that. Zarin found her in the side corridor less than 15 minutes after she left the dance floor. She had slipped away from the reception floor through the servants' passage, not to hide, but because she had always needed, at large gatherings, a few minutes of quiet to let her thoughts settle before she could continue being effectively present. It was simply how she was built, and she had long since stopped apologizing for it. She had barely reached the alcove near the east wing staircase, a small recessed space between two arches, lit by a single sconce, just wide enough to contain one person standing comfortably, when she heard his footsteps coming. Zarin moved quickly for a man who ordinarily governed his pace with the certainty of someone who knew the world would wait. He was at the alcove within 40 seconds of her reaching it, and he stopped 3 feet from her with his hands at his sides, and something in his expression that she had not, in all her observations of him, seen before. Not anger. It did not have the heat of anger, not the cold of his usual management. Something between and beneath both. something that was working against the composure rather than filling it. "What happened on that floor?" he said. Elara looked at him. "What specifically are you asking?" "Between you and Devereaux." His voice was level but tightly held, the specific tightness of a man controlling something by effort rather than by nature. "When you were both standing motionless on the dance floor, I watched it happen. What was it?" She considered the question. She considered several ways to answer it, and she discarded the ones that were evasive or partial, because she had decided before she left the antechamber this morning that she was going to live in the clear sight of what was true, and that decision extended to this corridor, and this man, and this conversation. "He told me," she said. "He called it a mate bond." Zarin was very still. "I cannot confirm that from my own understanding," she said. "I know what I felt. I don't have a prior experience to place it against. But he named it, and he was not uncertain about the name, and I am telling you because you ask me directly, and I do not deceive the people I am bound to." She let a beat pass. "Even when I have not been extended the same consideration." Silence. "What does that mean?" he said. Not quite a question. More like a man walking towards something he has seen from a distance, and is now standing close enough to read. She held his gaze. She had decided this. On the walk from the dance floor, she was going to say what she knew. Not because she was angry. The anger had been real, and had moved through her, and left something cleaner behind it. Not because she wanted to wound him, because she was a woman who had decided to live in clear sight of the truth, and this was part of the truth, and she was not going to carry it alone. "This morning," she said, "I was walking toward the north antechamber. I passed the east study. The door was not fully closed." She watched his face, and she saw it. The specific quality of stillness that came over him. Not his usual controlled stillness. Something different, something that had the quality of a man who has been seen by someone he had not expected to be seen by. "I heard you tell Elder Harrow what this marriage is," she said, and her voice was even and clear. Not heated, not sharp. Simply precise. An arrangement. A variable resolved. "You said I was a practical woman who would understand what she was entering, and cause no complications." A pause. She let each of these words occupy its proper space. "And then I heard how your voice changed when Harrow said a name, and I understood what that change meant. And I have been carrying that understanding since before I walked down the aisle." Zarin looked at her. In his face, something was happening that was more complex than anything she had seen him express before. It was not guilt alone, though there were elements of that. It was not remorse alone. It was the particular experience of a man who has been accurately seen by someone he had been holding at a careful distance, and who is now processing both the seeing and the distance. "Elara," he started. "You don't need to explain it," she said, not unkindly. "I already understand it. I understood it clearly when I heard it through that door. I am not telling you this to cause you difficulty. I am telling you because you deserve to know that I know, and because the alternative is continuing to build something on ground neither of us can see, and I don't build that way." She looked at him steadily. "You were honest with Harrow. I am asking that you extend me the same." The corridor was quiet, except for the distant sound of the reception music reaching them through the walls, muffled and gentle. He was silent for a long time, and then something happened to his expression that she had not predicted, not from the man she had assembled from the morning's evidence. The composure did not break. He was too practiced for that, and perhaps too deep in his habits. But it shifted, like watching a surface that appears solid reveal, at a specific angle, and in specific light, that there is something moving underneath it. "You were not meant to hear that," he said. "No," she agreed, "I was not. What I said to Harrow is how I operate. It has always been how I operate. I identify the requirement, and I provide for it, without allowing other considerations to interfere with the execution. I was not." He stopped. He looked for a different approach. "I was not speaking of you as a person in that room. I was speaking of the situation." "I know," she said. "That is precisely part of what made it difficult." He looked at her, with the particular attention of a man, receiving something he had not prepared to receive. She had the distinct sense that she was saying things to him in a way that people did not often say things to him. Directly, completely, without the buffer of social softening or the management of his feelings, and that the directness was doing something to him that he was not yet sure how to respond to. He took a step toward her. His hand moved. Not to take her hand, not to claim anything, but in the gesture of a man who has something to offer and is uncertain how to offer it. An imprecise and genuine thing from someone who was not accustomed to imprecision, or to the exposure that genuine things required. She looked at his hand. She looked at his face. She took one step back, clean, clear. He let his hand fall. "I need the evening to think," she said. "I am asking that you give me that." He held her gaze for a moment, and in his expression she could see the processing happening, the collision of several things at once, the management of a situation that was not yielding to management in the ways it should. Then he nodded. Once, with the precision that was always who he was. He turned and walked back down the corridor, and she stood in the alcove and breathed, and let herself be exactly where she was, clear about what she knew, uncertain about one thing only, which was what she intended to do with it. She turned toward the staircase. She needed air. The east terrace was a small stone ledge above the inner garden on the palace's east side, accessible through an unmarked door at the end of the upper corridor. Ilara had found it on her first night in the palace, during the hours between midnight and 4, when she had not been able to sleep, and had needed a place that was not her assigned chambers. It had 2 stone benches and a row of potted trees, mostly empty of leaves, and it was not on any schedule, not assigned to any ceremony, not guarded or observed, and it was the closest thing to an honest place she had found in the palace since she arrived. She had been standing at the railing perhaps 12 minutes, arms crossed against the cold of the night air, face turned upward toward the sky, which was very dark and very clear, with the kind of stars that only exist above places that have enough distance from human light, when she heard the terrace door open. She had thought it would be Saren. The footsteps that followed told her immediately that it was not. She turned. Caspian stood at the door with one hand still on the frame, in a coat with the collar turned up against the cold. He looked at her across the stone of the terrace. "I followed you," he said. "I am not going to suggest that I arrived here by coincidence." "I know," she said. "I thought you might." He came forward several steps, and then stopped, positioning himself at a deliberate distance, close enough to speak to her without raising his voice, far enough to give her room she had not asked for, but that he apparently understood she needed. She noted this and filed it. He looked out briefly at the garden below, the dark geometric shapes of the hedges, the faint sound of the fountain reaching them even here, and then back at her. "Are you all right?" he said. It was a direct question with no preferred answer built into it. He was not asking in order to position himself as the solution to whatever she said. He was asking the way a person asks when they want to know what is true, and are prepared for any version of it. "I am processing things in the order they have arrived," she said. "What is the next thing in the sequence?" "Determining what I know well enough to act on," she said. She looked at him. "And what acting means." He nodded. He came a few steps closer and leaned against the low stone railing at the terrace's edge, positioning himself at a slight angle that made the conversation feel less like a confrontation and more like 2 people looking at the same thing from nearby positions. She appreciated the instinct behind it. "Then let me give you the rest of what I have," he said, "so your sequence is complete." She waited. "The mate bond is real," he said, "not metaphorical, not a feeling that can be mistaken for something else, with time or context. It is real, and it is recognized under the old laws, which predate the Northern Court's founding by centuries, and have not been successfully challenged in any court I know of." He spoke without rushing, as if he had decided in advance how he was going to explain this, and was following the plan. "What you felt on the dance floor, the warmth, the current, the recognition, that has no prior instance. That is what it always is. It does not fade. It does not change quality. It is simply present. And it is the same for you," she said. Not a question. "Yes," he said. "The same for me." She absorbed this. "What does the bond actually mean? What does it require?" "It requires nothing," he said. He said this with emphasis, the emphasis of a man who wants to be heard on a specific point. The bond creates a connection. It does not override will. It does not remove your ability to decide what you do with the existence of that connection. Any man who tells you the bond compels your behavior is wrong, and is probably telling you that because it suits him. He held her gaze. "Your autonomy is entirely yours, Ilara. The bond changes nothing about that." She let this settle. "You rode here today without knowing for certain," she said. "Yes." And if you had arrived and nothing had happened, I would have apologized formally for the disruption, he said, and I would have left. Without argument and without claim. I had no claim without the bond. I understood that before I set out. He paused. The possibility of arriving to find nothing was real, and I had made my peace with it before I came. Because you had to know, she said. Because I had to know, he said simply. Yes. She looked at him in the cold night air, and thought about that. The specificity of it. The choice to come and find out, regardless of what finding out might reveal. And the timing, she said. You understand what you walked into. I do, he said. I have thought about little else since this morning, and I have not arrived at a way of framing it that makes it fully clean. There is no fully clean version. He looked at her directly. What I can tell you is that I did not come to take anything that wasn't freely given. I came to find out if something real existed, and then to tell you what it was, because you deserve to know what is real and what is yours. He paused. The rest, what you do with it, what you decide, that is entirely and completely yours. I am not here to choose for you. I am not capable of choosing for you even if I wanted to, which I do not. She stood on the cold stone ledge and she thought. She thought about the ring on her finger, and the ceremony, and the morning, and the 3 inches of space in a door that had started the whole day differently than she had planned. She thought about the warmth in her chest that was still there, quiet and steady. She thought about a man who had reached toward her in a corridor, and a man who was standing at a careful distance on a terrace, and offering her the truth, and then the space to do whatever she decided with the truth. She thought about who she was, and what kind of life she had always been trying to find her way toward. Thank you, she said, for coming, for the truth, for... She searched for the right word, and found it. For not making this a performance. Something eased in his face, briefly visible, and then held. Thank you for listening, he said, genuinely. I find listening useful, she said, more than most things. Then we have that in common, he said, among other things. They stayed a while longer on the terrace, speaking about smaller things. The cold, the distance he had traveled, the sound of the fountain below, and the conversation had, in the strangeness of the night, an almost ordinary quality. And then he said he would leave her to her thinking, and he did exactly that. An honest bow, a clean departure, the sound of the door, and then she was alone. She stayed until the cold had pressed through the gown, and she could not reasonably ignore it. Then she went inside to find Saren, who was waiting. Saren was in the chair by the fire when Alara pushed through the chamber door, her hands folded in her lap, her face in the particular expression she wore when she had been waiting for something and had decided while waiting exactly how she was going to receive it. The fire had been built well and the room was warm, which was the first uncomplicated good thing Alara had felt since the morning, and she stood in the doorway for a moment just to let the warmth meet her before she moved inside. She sat across from Saren. The fire was between them, burning clean and even. She looked at it for a moment. Tell me everything, Saren said. Alara told her. She went through it from the corridor, the door, the 3-inch gap, the words, the name and the silence after it, through the ceremony, and the hollow weight of standing at the altar with full knowledge in her chest, through the procession and the reception, and the way Zarin had moved correctly at her side for hours, without ever speaking to her once. She told her about the doors opening, and the man who walked through them, and the dance floor, and the warmth, and what he had said while they were standing still in the center of the room. She told her about Zarin in the alcove, and the reaching hand, and the one step back. She told her about the terrace, and Caspian's explanation, and the distance he had kept, and the choice he had placed fully, and without qualification in her hands. Zarin listened to all of it. When Alara finished, the only sound in the room was the fire. What do you feel? Zarin said. Alara looked at the fire. I feel like I have been given more information in a single day than I have had time to properly absorb, she said, and I feel that the version of this morning I began with no longer exists, and the version that replaces it is still becoming clear to me. That's your mind, Zarin said. What does the rest of you say? Alara looked at the flames. They burned cleanly and without self-consciousness, which was one of the things she had always found honest about fire. The rest of me, she said slowly, knows that I have spent 2 years building a belief. The belief that what I agreed to, and what I wanted, were close enough to the same thing, that I could commit to both at once, that the life I was going to, and the life I was meant for, could become the same life if I worked hard enough and stayed patient long enough. She paused. Tonight I learned that one half of that belief was standing on air. She looked up from the fire and at Saren's face. And I learned that something else is there, something I had no name for this morning. You know what you're going to do, Saren said. Not a question. I think I do, Elara said. You've known since the dance floor, Saren said. You're letting it settle so you can be certain before you say it aloud, which is what you always do. And when you are certain, you will act. She looked at Elara with the steady, affectionate attention of someone who has been watching a person be themselves for 12 years and has come to trust what they see. Are you certain yet? Elara was about to answer when the knock came. 3 measured knocks at the chamber door. Careful, not imperious. The knock of a person who is uncertain of their welcome and is making that uncertainty visible rather than concealing it. Elara and Saren looked at each other. That's him, Elara said. Saren said nothing. Elara rose and crossed the room and opened the door. Saren stood in the corridor alone. No guards within immediate range. She understood this was deliberate. He was without his formal jacket. His collar was open at the throat, and he was standing with his hands at his sides, in a posture that was so different from his usual precisely maintained presentation that she registered it as almost a different person, inhabiting a familiar silhouette. He looked like a man who had removed something he usually wore. He looked at her. I know the hour is late, he said. It is, she agreed. I need to say something that I should have said before anything else that happened today. He paused. Not for effect. She could read the difference now. For the real purpose, to make sure he had what he was about to offer before he offered it. I have done this wrong, Elara. Not just this evening, not just this morning, though what you heard through that door was real, and I am not going to ask you to discount it. The entire approach, the way I categorized this marriage before it began, the way I spoke of you to Harrow, as though the question of you was a procedural matter, to be resolved efficiently, rather than a person to be reckoned with. His jaw tightened once. I have always operated this way. I separate things, personal from political, feeling from function, because I decided years ago that separation was how you stay effective. But what I separated, in this case, was the person I was entering a life with, and that was wrong. Not strategically, actually wrong. She looked at him. She thought about the corridor, the gap, the words, the silence after a name. Would you have said this tonight, she asked, if Caspian Devereaux had not walked through those doors? A short pause, very short, but present. I want to say yes, he said. I am not certain enough to say it with full honesty. He held her gaze. What I can tell you is that what I am saying now is real. It is not a response to competition. It is a response to watching someone I had placed in a category show me, clearly and without intending to, that the category was wrong. She believed him. She looked at his face, and she believed this was a true thing he was saying to her. Real, in the way that things are real when they cost something to arrive at. She also knew something else, with the same completeness that she had been arriving at all day. That real was not always enough. That a man could be doing genuine work toward becoming something better, and still not be where you needed him to be at the moment when that mattered most. I am going to be honest with you in return, she said, because that is what you have given me, and I believe honesty should be given back. She held his gaze with the same level steadiness she had given him all day. I walked into this day carrying something, a hope, specific, patient, practical. The real kind of hope that a person builds when they have decided to commit to something fully, even though the beginning is difficult. I was carrying that when I walked down the aisle, she breathed. What I know now is that you were not holding anything at the other end, not because you are a dishonest man, because you were not there. You were somewhere else, in a separate room, and I was the arrangement that closed the door between them. She paused. I cannot rebuild the hope from where I am standing, not quickly, and I do not think the time that rebuilding would require is available to us. He was quiet. Something moved across his face that had no clean single name. Devereaux, he said finally. Yes, she said. He stood in the corridor for a long moment, then he nodded, with the precision that was always his, in any condition. Rest, he said. We can speak in the morning. Yes, she said. We can. He turned and walked back down the corridor, and she closed the door and stood with her back against it, and breathed slowly in the warm room, and she looked at the ring on the dressing table, where she had set it, without fully deciding to some time in the past hour, and she looked at Saren in the chair by the fire, and she breathed. Saren watched her. "Sit down," Saren said. Alara sat. They stayed by the fire together, not speaking, until the fire burned down. Then Alara lay down on the bed in her dress, and looked at the ceiling, and let the night move through her, and somewhere before the darkest hour passed, the last piece of the decision settled quietly and permanently into place. Not with drama, not all at once. The way understanding settles when you have given it enough room, gradually, and then completely, and with no intention of moving. She was at the window when the sky began to change. She had not slept. She had stopped trying around 3 in the morning and had moved from the bed to the window seat, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders and sitting with her legs folded beneath her, watching the sky. It was very dark outside, the particular darkness of the last hours before dawn, and the stars were still visible in the kind of number that cities prevent. She did not spend the night suffering. That was important, she thought afterward, to understand about it. She was not lying awake in pain or in conflict. The decision had settled. What she was doing was reviewing. She was the kind of person who reviewed large decisions one final time before acting on them, going through every angle with honesty and full attention, making certain she had not missed anything, and then acting. She reviewed the alliance, the real political work her father had done, the border families, whose security was woven into what he had built, the thousands of people along the eastern territories, for whom this arrangement had promised protection. She gave these considerations their full weight without minimizing them, or using the urgency of the morning to brush past them. They were real. They mattered. She reviewed what she had accepted and why. She reviewed the cost of what she had been asked to give, and whether the cost had limits, and where those limits were. She had thought about this before, had thought about it carefully, before she agreed, before she said yes, but she thought about it again now, with everything the day had added to her understanding. She arrived at the same place, that she had entered this arrangement in good faith and with full commitment, and that the arrangement had not been what was presented to her, and that the commitment she had made was to something that did not actually exist. You could not be bound by a promise to a thing that turned out to be different from what the promise was made to. She had not decided to believe this because it was convenient. She believed it because it was true, and she had looked at it from every available angle, and it was still true. She reviewed Caspian, the warmth, the bond, what it was and what it required, what he had said on the terrace, carefully, specifically, without pressure, and the manner in which he had said it, and what that manner told her about who he was. She thought about her mother, who had walked through a door trembling, and come out the other side, into a life that was genuinely hers. The sky changed. Black to charcoal to deep gray, to the specific blue that exists only in the 20 minutes before dawn, makes itself fully visible. She watched it change the way she watched everything important, completely, without looking away. She rose when the first pale light appeared at the horizon. She washed her face with cold water from the basin, and the cold was honest and good. She changed from the wedding gown, laying it across the bed with care, because someone had made it carefully, and it deserved to be handled accordingly, and dressed in the simple dark dress Saren had laid out the previous evening. She pulled her hair back and pinned it plainly. She looked at herself in the mirror, and she looked like a woman who had spent a night at the edge of one thing, and was about to step over into the other side. The ring was on the dressing table where she had set it in the night. She looked at it for a long moment. The dark metal and pale gold, the two lines worked together. It was a beautiful object. Someone had made it with real skill and genuine care. She left it on the table. Saren was already up. She was standing in the connecting doorway in her practical morning clothes, looking at Alara, with the expression of a woman who had made her own peace with what was happening, and was ready to help. "I need to go downstairs," Alara said. "I know," Saren said. "Alone," Alara said. Saren looked at her for a moment. Then she stepped aside and held the door. Alara walked into the corridor and did not stop. The palace at this hour had the suspended quality of a place that had not slept. She passed guards who acknowledged her with professional neutrality. She passed a servant who looked and quickly looked elsewhere. The corridors carried the specific atmosphere of a household that was waiting for something to be resolved, and they were right to be waiting. The great hall doors were open. She walked through them. They were all there, both kings, the senior court members, Elder Harrow in his usual position with his hands folded and his dry face revealing nothing. Lady Cora near the wall, with her sharp eyes already on Alara from the moment she appeared in the doorway. Lord Wren and 2 other senior lords from the northern court. Caspian's aide Nate, standing a few steps behind his king. Mrs. Alden, improbably, near the back. Word had moved through the night the way it always moved through royal households. Through walls and whispers, and the collective understanding of people who recognized when something significant required witnesses. Zarin stood near the center of the room. He was formally dressed. The composure was present, but not intact in the way it usually was. She could see this now, the barely visible cost of what he was managing. He was looking at the doors, at her. Caspian stood at the far side of the room, near the tall east-facing windows. He was not positioned confrontationally. He was simply there, standing with his hands loose at his sides, occupying space without requiring anything from it. He was watching Alara enter the room, with the full, quiet attention he gave to everything. She walked to the center. She stopped. The hall was quiet. Not the quiet of agreement, but the quiet of people who understand that what is about to happen should not be interrupted by anything, including themselves. She looked at Zarin first. "I have thought about everything I know," she said. Her voice was clear, and it reached every part of the room without effort. She was not raising it for effect. She simply had something to say, and she said it at the volume it required. "I have thought about the alliance my father negotiated, and the people along the eastern border who depend on it, and I have given that weight its full and honest due. I have thought about the commitment I made at that altar yesterday, which I meant when I made it, and I will not pretend otherwise." She paused for a single breath. "And I have thought about what it means to keep a commitment when the ground it was built on turns out to be different from what it was described as." Zarin was absolutely still. "I honored you yesterday," she said. "I honored this arrangement fully, and without reservation. I showed up as myself, completely, with every real thing I had. I said true words at the altar, and I meant them in the truest way I was able to mean them." She met his gaze and held it without hardness. "But I heard your words to Harrow. I watched your eyes on the dance floor. I had a long night to understand the full shape of what this is. And what it is, even at your best, is a well-managed arrangement. Not a life, not a real one." She breathed. "I deserve a real one. I have not always been certain of that. I am certain of it now." No one in the hall made a sound. She reached to the small display table beside her. She opened her hand. She set the ring on the table. The sound was very small, less than a footstep, less than a breath. But in the absolute silence of the great hall, it was the most complete and final sound anyone present had heard all morning. She looked at Zarin's face. He was looking at the ring, then at her, and what was on his face was not the composed management she had always seen from him. It was something that had gotten past the management, something that looked, underneath the effort of containing it, very much like loss. "I am sorry," she said honestly. "Not for this choice. It is the right one for both of us, even if it doesn't feel that way to you yet. But for the pain of it. That pain is real, and I know it." She held his gaze with full attention. "You have a great deal more real inside you than you have been willing to use, Zarin. I hope you find a way to open that room." "I genuinely do." He said nothing. What was on his face was too complicated to name quickly, and she did not have the time, or the purpose, to wait for it to resolve. She turned. She looked across the room at Caspian, who had not moved from his position by the windows, who had not approached or gestured or made any move that could be read as claim or possession or the performance of victory. He had simply stood and waited and kept his hands exactly where they were and watched her. She walked toward him. When she reached him, he looked at her face. Just that, for a moment, reading her fully and quickly, with the attention that was simply how he was. "Are you certain?" he said. "Yes," she said. He held out his hand. She took it. The warmth in her chest opened fully and steadily, not a rush, not a flood, but the slow, certain expansion of something that has been held carefully and is now allowed, for the first time, simply to be what it is. Like a room that has been closed through a long season, opening its windows to the morning. They walked out of the great hall together. Behind them, the room began to move. The advisors would begin their work. The alliance would be addressed. The political machinery would do what it always did, because it was built to keep moving, regardless of what happened to the people inside it. But that was behind her now. Ahead of her was morning light coming through the palace doors, and the open air beyond them, and a life that was, from this moment, entirely and genuinely hers. She did not look back. 6 months later, autumn had arrived in the Eastern realm, in the particular way it arrives in high country. All at once, without much warning, the trees going from green to amber, and red and deep gold, over the course of a week that felt shorter than it should have. Ilara's study was on the south side of the Eastern Palace, chosen for the morning light, which came in long and level through the tall windows, and landed on the desk at the angle that suited reading and detailed work. She had opened the windows when she arrived at her desk that morning, as she did most mornings now, because she had discovered, in the months of learning to live here, that she liked beginning the day with something honest against her face, and cold morning air in autumn was one of the most honest things she had found. She had been here 6 months, and the study was hers in the way rooms become yours over time, not by assignment, but by accumulation. The books on the shelves were hers, or had become hers. The arrangement of her desk had shifted from its original configuration to the one that suited the particular way her mind worked, with the most current correspondence in the upper left and the reference materials she used most frequently along the right wall. A small ceramic dish in the corner held dried flowers that Saren had pressed on the first day of their arrival and placed there without explaining why, which Ilara had understood to mean, "This is your place," and had never moved. The map of the Eastern Realm was pinned to the wallboard near the door, covered in her handwriting at this point, notes from council meetings, questions she had written down to follow up on, figures from the regional reports that she had wanted to track over time. She had started annotating it in the 3rd week and had not stopped since, because it was how she learned a place, by building a picture of it in her own hand until the picture started to feel like knowledge rather than information. She was responsible for real things here. That was what still surprised her most, 6 months in, when she had time to notice what surprised her. Not the warmth of the Eastern Court, though it was warmer than the Northern Court, in the specific way of institutions built by people who had decided that genuine connection and efficient governance were not actually competing values. Not the mate bond, which was real and present and had settled over the months into something that felt less like a phenomenon and more like a natural feature of her life, the way certain relationships feel after enough time, not like something you are managing, but like something you simply have. What surprised her was the work. The genuine, consequential, serious work of governance that Caspian had placed in front of her almost immediately, without ceremony and without the sense that he was doing her a favor, because he was not doing her a favor. He was doing what made sense, which was giving the most capable person he had access to the responsibilities she was capable of carrying. She had walked into the first regional council meeting in the 2nd week of her arrival, expecting to observe. Caspian had introduced her as queen and as a full participant, and the council had calibrated their behavior to his lead within the first 20 minutes. And by the end of the meeting, she had asked 3 questions and made 1 recommendation, and afterward, Caspian had told her the recommendation was sound and had been incorporated into the decision, not as a compliment, as a fact. She had become genuinely good at this work, not good in the sense of adequate, but in the sense of discovering an aptitude she had known she had without ever having had the proper context to use it. She had a mind built for the specific complexity of governance, the simultaneous consideration of multiple stakeholders, the long-term view, the ability to find the version of a solution that the parties could actually receive, even when it was not the version any of them had originally proposed. These were tools she had always carried. Using them in a context that actually mattered, in decisions that would actually change things for real people, felt different from anything she had done before. Different, and necessary, in the way that only things you were built for feel necessary. Caspian did not manage her. He consulted her, disagreed with her when he disagreed with her, directly, and without softening the disagreement into something more palatable, because he had established from their first week that he respected her enough to give her the full version of his thinking, and he absorbed her disagreements in return with the same honest consideration. They argued sometimes, real arguments, not performances of argument, the kind where both people are genuinely trying to find the truest version of something, rather than trying to win. She had found, to her own surprise, that she enjoyed it. She had understood gradually, and then all at once, happy. Not in the large dramatic sense of the word, which she had always suspected was overstated. In the quieter, more durable sense, the kind of happy that comes from being correctly placed in your own life. From waking in the morning and knowing the day would require real things from you. From being seen, daily and without novelty, by someone who was paying genuine attention. She was thinking about this on a Tuesday morning in early autumn, reading through the Northeastern Council correspondence with the cup of tea that Saren brought her at 8 every morning without exception, when Nate appeared in the study doorway with an expression she recognized. He wore this expression when he was bringing her information she had not requested, and was uncertain of its reception. "My queen," he said. She looked up. "What is it, Nate?" "A visitor at the eastern gate." He paused in a way that communicated the identity of the visitor before he said it. He came alone. 2 guards only, no formal announcement or advance notice. He gave his name to the gate captain and requested to be received, if you were willing. Another pause. "It is Zarin Blackwood." Elara set down the document she had been reading. She looked out the window at the amber trees along the palace road. A wind was moving through them, slow and unhurried, turning the leaves on their stems so that the undersides caught the light differently for a moment before settling again. She looked for anger. It was not there, had not been there for some months, having moved through her at the proper speed and left something quieter behind. She looked for the particular ache of old hurt, reduced to almost nothing, which she noted with the honest satisfaction of someone who has done real work and can see the results of it. She looked for fear. She found only a mild alertness, the alertness of someone encountering something they have thought about and are prepared for. "Tell the gate captain to receive him and bring him to the south courtyard," she said. "Tell him I will be there in 30 minutes. She picked up the correspondence again. "And keep it quiet for now." Nate nodded and left. She worked for the next 23 minutes on the Northeastern correspondence, completing the review with the same attention she would have given it on any other morning, because the work was real, and the people it affected were real, and that did not stop being true, because of who was waiting in the courtyard. Then she set the papers in their correct order, rose, and walked downstairs. The south courtyard was her favorite of the palace's outdoor spaces. Walled on 3 sides, low fountain in the center, the row of herbs along the south-facing wall that kept their color longer than anything else in the autumn garden. It smelled of cold water and late rosemary, and the specific damp stone smell of a garden that was still alive but preparing for winter, and it felt to her like a place that did not require anything false of the people who stood in it. Zarin was by the fountain when she entered through the gate. He was alone, had sent his guards to wait at the road, which she understood immediately had been deliberate. He was in practical traveling clothes, nothing formal, and he looked different from the last time she had seen him. Not worse. Different in the specific way of a person who has been living through something that has worked on them, and who shows the evidence of that work. He had always been a man of precise control. The control was still there, but something under it had shifted. He turned when he heard her on the stone path. He looked at her across the courtyard. She walked to the bench nearest the fountain and sat, and gestured to the bench across from her. He crossed and sat. For a moment, they were simply 2 people in the same space, with the fountain between them and the cold air around them, and 6 months between this moment and the last time they had occupied the same room. "You look well," he said. "I am well," she said. "You look like you have been sleeping less than usual." He accepted this without argument. "Yes," he said. He looked at the fountain briefly. "I wanted to come sooner. I decided to wait until I had something worth saying, rather than simply arriving with the need to account for myself." "And now you have something worth saying," she said. "I believe so." He met her gaze with a directness that had not been characteristic of him 6 months ago, and clearly had developed since. "I came to tell you that the Eastern Alliance has been rebuilt. My advisors worked with your father's team over the past several months, and the terms are now independent. The alliance no longer requires your marriage as its foundation. It stands on its own merits." He paused. "Your father's position is fully protected. The border territories are secured. The agreement will hold." Elara looked at him steadily. "Why did you do that?" "Because it was the right thing," he said, without hesitation. "And because your father spent 4 years building something real, and that work deserves to stand on its own foundation. rather than on his daughter's life. He held her gaze. I am not here to ask for anything in return for this. I want to be clear about that before anything else. This is not a negotiation. She believed him. Thank you, she said. That is genuinely good work. He nodded once. There is more I came to give you, he said. Then give it. An apology, he said. A real one. Not the version I gave you in the corridor the night of the wedding, which was true, but still had the quality of a man explaining himself, rather than a man taking responsibility. He looked at her directly, and she could see the effort of it. Not the effort of performing sincerity, but the effort of a person doing something they are not practiced at, and doing it anyway. I failed you before we were married, and I failed you on the day of the marriage, and I have been living with the specific quality of that failure for 6 months, and I needed to come here and say it clearly. He held her gaze. You showed up fully. You brought every real thing you had. And I had already put you in a box before you arrived, and I kept you there, and that was wrong. Not procedurally. Actually wrong. In the way that people are wrong to each other. Ilara sat with that. She let it arrive in her exactly as it was, real, and specific, and earned. She thought about the morning of the wedding, and the gap in the door, and the words through it. She thought about how far away that morning felt from where she was sitting. I accept your apology, she said, fully and without reservation. It is real, and it is enough. He looked at her as though he had been holding something, and had just been given permission to set it down. I have one more thing, he said. Lyra and I are no longer in contact. I ended that 3 months ago. He held up a hand briefly. I am not telling you this as part of a bargain, or as something to trade for your regard. I am telling you because it is true, and because you gave me honest things, every time I gave you an opening, and you deserve the same in return. He paused. I realized, over the months, that the separation I had always maintained was not discipline. It was avoidance. I was using the separate rooms to prevent myself from being fully present in any of them, including the most important one. I am working on that, slowly and with more difficulty than I anticipated. He looked at his hands briefly. But I am working on it. Ilara looked at him in the autumn courtyard, and she thought about the man at the altar 6 months ago. Hands precisely clasped, face perfectly managed, saying excellent words in the voice of a contract being signed. She thought about the corridor that night, the hand that reached, the step she had taken back. She thought about the look on his face when the ring made its quiet sound on the wooden table. And she thought about growth, about the fact that it arrives on its own schedule, not the one you would have chosen for it, and that this did not make it less real. I think you are going to be all right, she said. She meant it without any irony, and without any residual bitterness, because she had worked through both, and this was what remained, a genuine wish for the well-being of someone she had been bound to, and was no longer bound to, and whose growth she was genuinely glad to see. I think the person you are capable of being is not a small one. I think it has been in that separate room for a long time, and I think opening it is the right work. She met his gaze. I hope you find someone who gets to know that person. I say that honestly. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her. You mean that, he said. I mean everything I say, she said. You know that by now. He looked at her for another long moment, a final, clear look, the kind you give when you are making sure you have seen something accurately before you stop looking at it. And then he nodded, with the precision that would always be his. He rose. Thank you for receiving me. Thank you for coming, she said, and for the alliance. That was the right thing. He left the courtyard. She heard his footsteps on the stone, heard the gate, and then the garden was only itself again, the fountain, the herbs, the cold morning air moving through things. She sat there for a while. She let the morning be exactly what it was, clear and cold and entirely honest. She felt something settle and release in her that had been waiting to settle. Something she had not known was still there until it was gone. Not pain. The last small weight of something unfinished, finally becoming finished. She rose and walked back through the palace. Caspian was in the main hall at the long central table, the territory maps spread before him. Nate beside him pointing at something in the northwest, where a border issue had been developing for the past several weeks. He looked up when she came through the passage door, and he read her face in the way he always did. Quickly, completely, without requiring her to translate. All right, he said. Yes, she said. She crossed the room toward him. He came to give me what he owed. He gave it. Caspian looked at her for a moment with the attention that was always, simply, how he was. And the alliance? Rebuilt, standing on its own, my father's work is protected. Something in him eased, not for himself, but for her. For the last strand of obligation that had been wound into the decision she had made, and that had occasionally tugged at her in the months since. Good, he said, simply and completely. Then he moved a fraction to make room for her beside him at the table. A small and entirely natural gesture. The gesture of a man making room for someone who belongs in the space. She came and stood beside him and looked down at the maps. The territory spread before them, the rivers and the ranges and the towns and the borderlines, all of it real and complex, and theirs together. Nate resumed his explanation of the Northwest situation. She listened and asked a question, and the morning moved forward into the work of the day. The way mornings do when you are correctly placed in a life that is genuinely yours. She thought sometimes about the morning of the wedding, about the gap in the door and the 3 inches of space that had changed everything. She did not think about it with grief or anger, or the particular weight of paths not taken. She thought about it the way you think about a necessary thing that was painful, with honesty, and with the acknowledgement that it had been exactly what it needed to be, in order to bring her to where she was. She put her hand flat on the map. Caspian's hand came to rest briefly at her back, warm and present and entirely itself. They looked at the territory together. She had work to do. She began.